I still remember that day clearly, the light rain falling after my husband's funeral, the man I had spent 17 years of my life with. I was sitting in the living room we used to decorate together every Christmas, my hands trembling slightly from a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Just hours after laying him to rest, my mother-in-law walked in her face, as cold as if there was nothing left to hide. Sarah. "I'll be brief," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Our family has made a decision. You should pack your things and leave here by the weekend." I stared at her, confused. I thought I misheard. "Leave? What do you mean, Mom? This is Jake and my home. We've lived here for nearly 2 decades. She cut me off this time, meeting my gaze, her eyes devoid of sympathy. Jake was my son. This house belongs to the Bennett family. You're not one of us. And now Jake is gone. Not one of them." I clenched the cold teacup in my hand. I had thought I was her daughter-in-law, not perfect, but always trying. I believed my love for Jake was enough to earn his family's acceptance, even if I didn't come from a prestigious background, didn't have an MBA, and didn't talk about the stock market over Thanksgiving dinner. But in that moment, I understood I never truly belonged. I was only tolerated while Jake was still here to anchor me. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I simply stood up and walked to the bedroom, the one where I had replaced every light bulb, organized every drawer, and folded every sheet. I pulled out the suitcases and packed in silence. 3 suitcases. That was all I was allowed to take. Jake's sister, the same woman who once called me sis when she needed tuition money, passed by me with indifferent eyes. "Thank you for looking after the house all this time," she said, her voice soft and bone-chilling, as if I were a housekeeper whose contract had just ended. Subscribe and share this story and your own experience in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. I still don't know how I managed to drive away that day. The sky was a deep, stormy gray, as if it were raging on my behalf. I left what once was a home, now nothing more than a battlefield gone cold. I drove toward a temporary rental near Tacoma, the only place I could find at the last minute. A small space with no bright windows, no bathtub, just a single bed, and an old fridge that rattled through the night. I sat on the floor staring at the unopened suitcase, and I cried, not because I had lost a house, but because I realized no one in his family had asked me, "Are you okay, or do you need anything?" Not a single person. We once had a golden retriever named Max. I was the one who fed him, walked him every morning. When Jake passed, they didn't let me see Max one last time. They took him away without a word. I began to be erased from everything. The bank accounts were locked. Jake's phone was handed over to his son from a previous marriage. Even the obituary in the local paper called him a devoted father, a beloved son, but there was no mention of husband. I called a lawyer. They said no will had been filed, that the estate would follow the law, and because the house was in Jake's name before we married, I had no legal claim if the family chose to contest it. I had once thought losing Jake would be the greatest pain of my life, but it wasn't. The greatest pain was being cast out of a life I had helped build, standing inside a home full of memories, yet not a single person saw me as part of the family. And the cruelest part, I still reached for the pillow each night, hoping to feel the warmth I once knew, only to remember I wasn't there anymore. And maybe I never truly was. I met Jake on a rainy March afternoon during a shift that stretched past midnight at the hospital where I worked as a nurse. He was a patient in orthopedics, an architect who had fallen down a flight of stairs while inspecting a site. I remember the awkward smile he gave as I changed his dressing. He said I had eyes that made people feel calm. I just laughed and told him he should thank the painkillers. We didn't fall in love at first sight. Ours wasn't that kind of love. It was a quiet bond, slow to form, like an old jazz tune you keep playing until you realize you can't stop. Jake had been married before and had a young son. He made no grand promises. I had no romantic illusions. But somehow we found each other through wounds that had yet to heal. The first time I visited his home, a large house in the northern suburbs of Seattle, His mother opened the door, looked me up and down, and said, "You're a nurse." It wasn't a question. It sounded like an accusation. I tried to smile and extended my hand. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Sarah." She didn't shake it. For years, I tried to be accepted. I cooked Thanksgiving dinners no one praised, only to hear my mother-in-law say, "Stuffing like this. It's too dry." I sent birthday cards to his sister. Not once did she reply. I stood quietly behind the family in every Christmas photo, always at the edge of the frame, near the tree, never at the center. But I kept telling myself as long as Jake loved me, everything would be okay. And Jake did love me. He listened like I was the only person in the room. He always placed a hand on my back as he walked by, a quiet way of saying I was seen. When I came home late from night shifts, he warmed up dinner and left a small note beside it. "Thank you for caring for the world. Now let me care for you." We never had children. I had been pregnant twice, an ectopic pregnancy and a miscarriage at 11 weeks. After the second, I sat on the bathroom floor, still holding the negative test, and Jake wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "We're still a family, Sarah. You are my family." And I believed that. Even without baby pictures on the walls, I believed in the little things we shared, morning coffee laughter over old shows, the quiet way he pulled the blanket up over me every night. I cleaned every room in that house like it was a temple of shared memories. I arranged flowers by hand, washed every curtain, fixed every squeaky hinge. No one hired me. No one paid me. I did it out of the love a woman pours into her home. And then with one sentence after the funeral, it all vanished. "You're not one of us." I started looking back with different eyes. Our 10th wedding anniversary party, when I wore a blush pink lace dress, and my mother-in-law quipped, "Oh, looking like a second bride already." I thought she was joking, but maybe that was the truth. I had always been the second bride, never truly the wife in their eyes. Even when Jake was hospitalized after the stroke, I was the one who called his family. I was the one who stayed up all night by his bedside, the one who held his hand as the heart monitor began to slow. But on his death certificate, the next of kin listed wasn't me. It was his mother. Someone had changed it without telling me. When I went to the bank to check our joint account, the teller said, "This account was closed 2 weeks ago." I froze. 2 weeks, meaning before he even passed. Who had done that? And why I had always believed I was a part of Jake's life. His wife, his partner, the one who kept the fire burning in his home. But looking back, I felt more like a shadow. A woman behind everything, cooking, caring, loving, but whose name was written nowhere. I didn't have the key to the safe. I didn't know the password to the retirement account. I wasn't listed on the deed to the house. When Jake was alive, he took care of everything, so I wouldn't have to worry. And now, I had nothing left to hold on to. One night in that cramped rented room, I sat and looked through old photo albums. I was in the pictures, but always off to the side. There were photos of my hands holding cakes, wrapping scarves around Jake, wiping paint from the wall, but never one where I truly belonged. That's when I realized for 17 years I had lived like a shadow, loving, sacrificing, existing, without ever having a place that was rightfully mine. I once thought I had hit rock bottom the night I miscarried at 11 weeks, curled up in the ER, while Jake sat silently beside me, his hand trembling with shock. But it wasn't. Rock bottom was a temporary rental with yellowed walls and a ceiling stained by watermarks. It was walking out of your own life, not because you chose to, but because you were pushed out like something old and unwanted. I lived the days after the funeral as if I had been swept away from everything familiar. No more cooking schedules, no more Jake's soft chuckle behind me as I washed the dishes. In their place was the screech of the old fridge every midnight, the footsteps of neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, and the terrifying silence of my own presence. I didn't dare touch the suitcases I had brought with me. They sat in the corner of the room like 3 remnants of a person who had lost her identity. I no longer knew who I was. I was no longer Jake's wife. No longer the woman who cared for the little pale blue house with the red shingle roof, the one who had once planted lavender with her bare hands along the front porch. Now I was just an unemployed middle-aged woman, living off the last of my meager savings and cheap meals from the 99-cent store. Each morning I woke up early as I used to, only to sit frozen on the chair. No one needed me to make breakfast. No one called out, "Hey, where's the coffee?" No one needed me anymore. I tried finding temporary work, hourly nursing care, in-home patient support, but most places required recent experience and private liability insurance. I had neither. Even my nursing license had expired, and I didn't have the money to renew it. I went to the bank holding on to the slim hope there might be something left in the joint account, but the teller just shook her head with quiet sympathy. That account was closed before his passing. I'm very sorry. I didn't understand. Jake would never do that. He wasn't the type to hide things. But everything felt orchestrated, as if someone had planned to push me out. I called the family lawyer Jake had once hired years ago to handle our home renovation contract, but the office told me there's no will on file under his name. What did that even mean? A man as meticulous as Jake leaving nothing behind. Not a single line, not one word of instruction. I called his son from his previous marriage, the boy I once drove to school, the one I stayed up with after he got bullied. He now called me Miss Sarah and said, "I think it's best if you leave this to the family." The family. That phrase again. I had thought I was family, but clearly, in their eyes, I had never truly been one of them. I was just someone who walked a part of life's path with Jake, someone who ceased to matter once he was gone. Every day, I found myself fighting against my own memories. Even the smallest things felt like cuts to the skin. Seeing someone wearing the same pale blue shirt Jake used to wear made my chest tighten. Hearing a song we had once danced to at his sister's wedding, I had to turn the radio off immediately. One afternoon, I saw a car just like Jake's on the street. I followed it for several blocks, heart pounding, only to realize the man behind the wheel was a stranger. I began losing sleep. Every night, I woke up halfway through reaching across the bed to a space that was painfully empty. My mind spiraled with questions that had no answers. Why did they hate me so much? Did Jake know something I didn't? Had I been blind for all those years loving a family that had never truly opened their doors to me? I wandered into a used bookstore near the place I was staying. The owner, an elderly Italian man named Salvatore, let me read for hours without buying anything. One day, he poured me a cup of ginger tea. Didn't ask a single question, just quietly allowed me to sit there for as long as I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't invisible. And then something small happened. In the pocket of one of Jake's old jackets, the one I had kept out of a grief-filled habit, I found a crumpled piece of paper nearly faded. It was a handwritten to-do list Jake had scribbled. 1. Meet with personal lawyer. 2. Update the will. 3. Make sure Sarah never has to worry. I read that third line over and over again. Make sure Sarah never has to worry. I clutched the paper like it was the last tether keeping me from drowning. If Jake truly intended to leave something behind for me, why did no one know about it? Or had someone deliberately hidden it? That was when I knew I had to find out the truth. Not to cling to money, but to reclaim myself. My place had been taken from me, but the memories, the love, the truth, they were still somewhere, and I wasn't going to let them be buried the way I had been. I couldn't sleep that night after reading Jake's note. Something stirred inside me, a faint instinct like a knock echoing through old memories. I got up and rummaged through the memory boxes I had packed in those 3 suitcases, hoping to find another clue, a missing piece of a puzzle left unfinished. And then I remembered Jake had a small private office he used to rent on the 3rd floor of an old building near downtown. He said it was a place to think and sketch in peace, but I always knew it was really just an excuse to escape work and family for a few hours. I rarely went there, but I knew he kept it right until the end. The next morning, I went. Somehow I still had the old key tucked in my wallet. The building had aged. The wooden stairs creaked with each step I took. Jake's office door opened to a small room dimly lit by a frosted glass window. Nothing had changed. On the desk, his unfinished sketch still lay open, and the Parker pen he always used rested beside it. An old coat hung over the back of the chair, and in the corner stood a weathered wooden cabinet with a locked drawer. I didn't know why I felt compelled to search it, maybe because every fiber in me was screaming for answers. I turned the drawer over, examined every crack and crevice, and then behind a loose lining board I discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was a small black metal box. My heart pounded. My hands trembled as I opened the lid of the box. Inside was a thick envelope, a small leather-bound notebook, and a notarized copy of a will dated 6 months before Jake passed away. I opened the envelope first. It was a letter, handwritten, in Jake's unmistakable script. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have enough time to give it to you myself as I had intended. I'm sorry I didn't do this sooner. But there's one thing I need you to remember. Everything I have, the house, the savings, the old truck, even the designs I left behind, these are all pieces of the life we built together. Not my mother, not my son, us, you. And if I'm no longer here to protect that, then I need you to protect it for me. You don't need to be humble anymore, Sarah. You don't need to shrink yourself to be accepted. You were the center of my life. Stand up and take back what's rightfully yours. I love you, Jake. I leaned back against the wall as the tears poured uncontained. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't crying from despair. I cried because I had been seen, because I had been acknowledged, because I had been loved, even if it came late. I opened the will. It was a legally notarized document bearing the signatures of 2 witnesses and the official seal of Jake's private attorney. The will stated clearly, all personal and real property currently in my possession is to be left to my wife, Sarah Miller Bennett. I am of sound mind and fully aware in making this decision, and I do so without any outside influence. I could hardly believe my eyes, and yet this will had never been filed. I thought back to that brief meeting with the family's attorney, a young man who happened to be Jake's brother's best friend. He had said, "There's no will on file." Now I understood they had deliberately withheld it. Maybe they didn't know Jake had left a copy in his private office. Maybe they believed they'd hidden everything, but they didn't know me, and they didn't know that Jake had anticipated it all. I picked up the leather-bound notebook. Inside were Jake's scattered notes, lists of expenses, plans for home renovations, ideas for the senior housing project he had dreamed of designing, and then something that stopped me cold. One page read, "Retirement account co-owner Sarah re-registered on 12/03. Life insurance sole beneficiary Sarah." It hit me all at once. December 3rd was my birthday. I had thought he had forgotten, but all along he had been quietly preparing everything. I left the office with the iron box clutched in my hands like it was a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like the one who had been left behind. I was the one carrying the truth. And truth, even when buried in the dark, always finds its way to the light. I called my lawyer, Catherine Hughes, an older woman I had once cared for when she fractured her hip. When I told her everything, she paused for a long moment, then said the one thing that made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. "Bring everything to me, and this time they're going to hear your voice." I folded Jake's letter and tucked it into my bag like it was the first piece of armor I had ever worn. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to wait for them to give me what I deserved. I was going to take it back. In my name. I arrived at Catherine Hughes's office on a foggy Monday morning, still gripping the iron box like it was a part of me. Her office was simple walls lined with old degrees and family photos, but the space radiated a sense of trust I hadn't felt in years. She wore round glasses, her white hair pinned neatly in a bun, and her eyes were sharp enough to see through things I hadn't even said yet. I laid out every document on the desk, the notarized will, Jake's handwritten letter, the notebook filled with notes where my name appeared again and again. Catherine read each page as though she were reopening a case she had waited her entire life to bring to justice. When Catherine looked up, she said, "They tried to bury this, but now we'll make sure they have to face it." I nodded for the first time, no longer trembling. There were no more tears, only resolve. We filed a formal petition with the probate court. Because the will was properly notarized and had 2 clear witness signatures, the case was accepted swiftly. A hearing was scheduled within 3 weeks to determine the validity of the will. I stayed silent. I didn't inform my mother-in-law. I didn't message Jake's son. I wanted them to find out the truth in a way they couldn't ignore in front of the law. On the day of the hearing, I wore a navy blue dress, my hair neatly tied back, no elaborate makeup. I didn't need to appear strong, I was strong. Catherine sat beside me, her hand gently resting on mine like a quiet reminder, "You're not alone." Jake's family arrived in full force. My mother-in-law wore a black shawl, still clinging to the role of the dignified widow. Jake's sister held her usual sneer. Jake's son, Scott, sat up front, spine straight, lips pressed tightly together, the expression of someone who thought they had already won. When the judge opened the session, he requested any supplemental documents. Catherine stood and presented the notarized original will, along with Jake's handwritten letter, as supporting evidence of his final intent. She spoke clearly, every word sharp and deliberate. "Your Honor, we have strong reason to believe that the decedent's family was aware of this will and intentionally withheld it. This constitutes a direct violation of the legal probate process and has caused clear harm to the sole named beneficiary, my client, Mrs. Sarah." The courtroom fell silent. I saw my mother-in-law clutch her handbag tighter. Scott shifted in his seat. Jake's sister rolled her eyes repeatedly. The judge reviewed the documents, then called upon the 2 witnesses whose signatures appeared on the will. Both confirmed they had witnessed Jake sign the document 6 months prior to his death at his private attorney's office. The judge turned to the other side of the room. "Does anyone contest the legal validity of this document?" No one spoke. Silence. And then the ruling was given. The will is valid. All assets, including real estate retirement accounts and personal property, are to be legally transferred to Mrs. Sarah Miller Bennett. I didn't hear the rest. Every sound in the room seemed to break into silence, but not the cold, bitter silence I had once endured when I was cast out of that house. This was the stillness of closure, the quiet that follows the final note of a long song. A chapter closed. As I stood to leave the courtroom, my mother-in-law looked at me as if she were seeing someone she never truly knew. Maybe she had never cared enough to wonder how strong I could be. Scott looked down. Jake's sister turned her face away. No one said a word. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need late regrets. I had what I came for: truth and justice. That afternoon, I drove back to the house that had once been a home, the place I was cast out of like a stranger. As I stepped inside, the scent of dried lavender I had once hung by the window still lingered faintly in the air. I walked through each room not to remember the pain, but to touch the parts of myself I had once lost. I didn't shout, "I won." I simply stood in the living room, watched the sunlight pour through the glass, and whispered, "Jake, I'm home." But this time, I wasn't returning as a wife looking for a place to belong. I came back as a woman who knew her worth, a woman who no longer needed to beg to be seen, who no longer had to bow her head just to be allowed to exist. I had taken back the house, taken back my name, and most importantly, reclaimed the voice I had lost living in silence. I returned to the old house on an early autumn afternoon. The wind was crisp and the leaves were turning golden at the porch, as if everything around me was shedding its old skin for a new beginning. The key in my hand was the same one, but the feeling as it turned in the lock was completely different. This time, I wasn't knocking to be let in. This time, I was opening the door under my own name. Inside, almost everything remained the same. The rug I had picked after 3 weeks of hunting through Etsy. The armchair Jake used to read in. The bookshelf I had built with mahogany, every nail hammered in by my own hand. But strangely, I didn't feel what I thought I would. No tears. No lump in my throat. Just emptiness. And clarity. I walked through the house as if I were a real estate agent touring the remnants of my own life, assessing every corner, every object, every space. I made notes the sofa needed replacing. The bedroom walls were too cold in tone. The kitchen could use better lighting. I didn't want to relive the memories. I wanted to renew them. Not because I was denying the past, but because I had changed. I hired a group of middle-aged women from a local artisan guild to help renovate the house. They arrived each morning at 9 a.m., bringing stories of divorce, early retirement, and raising 3 kids on their own. I made tea for them, listened as they talked, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged to a community that didn't need anyone to be perfect. We painted the walls a soft, warm ivory, took down all the old photographs, and replaced them with prints of wildflowers in raw wooden frames. I swapped out the heavy curtains for lightweight linen to let the natural light flood in. Each day, a tired part of my soul was replaced with something new, calmer, no longer craving recognition. I sold Jake's old pickup truck. It had been his most treasured possession, but I knew he wouldn't want me to keep it if it reminded me of pain. I used the money to start a small scholarship fund in his name for nursing students who had lost a loved one while still in school. I wrote to the local nursing college explaining that I wanted to give away what had once helped me survive love and even grief. One day, I received a handwritten letter from a second-year student named Aisha. She wrote, "Dear Miss Sarah, I lost my mother last year to a stroke. I thought I'd have to drop out and work, but thanks to your scholarship, I'm still in school. I'll become a nurse like my mother and maybe like you too. Thank you for believing in me, even though we've never met." I read that letter and burst into tears, not from pity, but because for the first time in years I felt I was creating something meaningful without needing anyone's permission. I began spending Tuesday afternoons at the nearby senior center, the same one Jake once sketched expansion plans for. I didn't tell anyone about my past. I simply showed up, chatted, played dominoes, helped Mrs. Mary with her crochet, read the newspaper to Mr. Howard. I didn't do it out of obligation. I did it because I wanted to, because I still had something to give. One day, Mrs. Mary asked, "Do you have a family, dear?" I smiled and replied, "I used to, and now I have myself." She nodded her eyes, carrying more understanding than any cliché could offer. "Then you're already rich." I also began writing again. Not a memoir, just small journal entries, moments where I felt alive, where I was breathing by my own will. One line I wrote on a rainy night, I don't need them to remember my name in a will. I just need to remember who I am. When I submitted a request to the bank to verify the retirement account, they replied, "The current co-owner is listed as Sarah Miller Bennett. You have full access." I signed the withdrawal form, and this time, my hand didn't tremble. I wasn't afraid anymore. I no longer felt like I was fighting for something, because I knew I was simply reclaiming what was rightfully mine. One afternoon, while watering the lavender on my balcony, the new neighbor leaned over and asked, "Have you lived here long?" I looked at the house and smiled. A very long time. But only recently did I really start living here. Now I begin each morning by brewing myself a cup of chamomile tea, placing it on the windowsill, and writing a few lines in the soft leather journal I bought at the local farmer's market. I don't write to remember others anymore. I write so I never forget myself. Some days the lines I write are short, like a whisper to my own heart. Today I don't need an invitation. I have the right to exist. I am not someone's wife, not someone's daughter-in-law, but I am me, and I am enough. I started growing vegetables, not to save money, but to prove to myself that I could nurture something without needing permission, without praise. All it takes is light time and a little faith, just like me. One day, I found an old wooden chair abandoned on the side of the road. I brought it home, stripped off the peeling paint, reupholstered the seat, and placed it on my balcony. That's where I sit every evening reading, watching the sky shift colors, and feeling a peace so deep it's as if I never walked through hell. Not because everything is perfect now, but because I stopped waiting for someone else to make me whole. My mother-in-law once said at Jake's funeral, a woman's worth is defined by how her husband's family respects her. I used to believe that so much that I lost myself in quiet submission. But now I know worth doesn't come from other people's acceptance. It comes from how you accept yourself. I no longer let anyone define me by a title. I don't need to be the good wife or the dutiful daughter-in-law. I don't cook to be praised, don't smile just to keep the peace. I live honestly sometimes, silent, sometimes furious, but always clear about what I want and what I will no longer tolerate. I've learned how to say no to calls that only come when someone needs a favor. No to gatherings where I feel invisible. No to giving away parts of myself to people who never valued the gift. I also learned how to say yes. Yes to the art workshop I started for older women in the community. Yes to coffee invitations from the widowed neighbor next door, just to share a conversation and ease the loneliness. Yes to myself on the days when I felt tired and needed forgiveness, not because I was wrong, but because I was human. One afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom, the same mirror I had once stared into with critical eyes. I placed my hand over my stomach, then on my cheek, then ran my fingers through the silver strands in my hair, and whispered, "Sarah, you're not perfect, but you are still light, and you don't need anyone to flip the switch anymore." I began doing something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I praised myself. You made it through. You're strong enough not to seek revenge. You're kind enough to forgive, but no longer naive enough to forget. You deserve happiness not because of who you are to others, but because of who you are to yourself. And strangely, when I stopped looking for validation from others, I was seen for the first time genuinely. A woman in the creative writing class I teach at the local library once said to me, "You have a way of telling stories that makes people believe pain can turn into poetry." I just smiled. I didn't downplay it. I didn't deflect it with modesty. I said, because it's real. And the truth, no matter how suffocated, will always find breath, as long as we let it live in its own name. I no longer stand outside the door of anyone's life waiting to be let in. I've built a room of my own, one that requires no invitation. I am the woman who was once cast out of the very house she helped build. I am the woman who once wept beside a cold gas stove because she couldn't afford to refill the tank. I am the woman who wrote hundreds of letters in her head, demanding justice but never sent a single one. But now, I am the woman who stood up and walked back into her own life without asking for permission. And I stayed not because someone allowed me to, but because I chose to. No one needs to give me a title for me to know I have worth. I am Sarah Miller Bennett, and for the first time in my life, that name is enough. If you've ever been pushed out of a place you once called home, if you've ever been made to feel invisible in a relationship you poured your whole heart into, if you've ever stood in a room full of familiar faces and still felt alone, then my story is for you to remind you that you are not alone. I lived nearly 2 decades as a devoted wife, the quiet keeper of a home I believed was mine. And then just days after my husband's death, I was erased from everything without a thank you, without a single gesture of condolence, without an acknowledgement that I had ever mattered in his life. But in the moments when I was being erased, I learned how to call myself back. I walked through every layer of grief, from rage to despair, from helplessness to stillness. I survived sleepless nights, days with nowhere to go, and the haunting question, if no one recognizes me, who am I? And then I realized, I am the one who cleaned every room. I am the one who held the hand of a dying man. I am the one who poured love into every corner, every meal, every quiet, fleeting moment. No one may have acknowledged it, but that doesn't make it any less real. Because what you build with love, no one can ever take away. My in-laws could kick me out of the house, but they could never erase the memories of me living there. They could hide the will, but they couldn't change the truth that my husband chose me. They could leave my name out of every conversation, but they could never strip me of the worth of my presence. I'm not telling this story to ask for sympathy. I don't need anyone's pity. I'm telling it to remind you, the woman watching this video in a quiet kitchen or curled up on the couch after the kids have gone to bed. You are not invisible. You are not insignificant. And you don't need anyone's permission to be yourself. Maybe your husband left you. Maybe your children no longer call every night. Maybe you're living a life that no one notices. But let me be living proof that from what others have discarded, you can rebuild an entire world with your hands, with your heart, and with a faith no one can take from you. I no longer want revenge. I no longer need to prove anything. I just want to live in peace and be able to look at myself in the mirror without regret. I choose forgiveness not because they deserve it, but because I deserve freedom. And if you're on that journey, whether you've just begun or are already halfway there, keep going. Even if no one claps, even if no one sees you, you are still moving toward the light. If my story reminds you of your mother, a woman who gave her life in silence without ever being named, share this. If you see yourself in the words I've spoken, leave a comment. Let other women know they are not small. Subscribe to this channel if you need a space to hear stories like this, where imperfect women share the paths they've walked and continue to walk with dignity, with light, and with a heart still whole. And if you're still listening, if you've made it to the very end, then let me say one last thing. No one can take away what you built with love, and nothing can extinguish the light of a woman who has decided to ignite it herself.